Take a look at this article in the Soviet newspaper Izvestia, April 1980. We had to make a choice. We either had to bring in the troops or let the Afghan communist revolution be defeated. It was not a simple decision to take. We knew that if the revolution fails, it would pave the way for massive US presence in a country that borders on the Soviet Union, and that this was a clear challenge to our country's security. What can you infer from this source about why the Soviets decided to invade Afghanistan in 1979? And think about how accurate this argument is. Obviously, this is a bit of propaganda. You could easily imagine a similar American one justifying their invasion of Vietnam in the 1960s. Have a look at this map. Have a think about everything we've learned about over the past few lessons and think, does this justify, or does this truly justify, why the Soviets decided to invade Afghanistan? At the end of last lesson, we learned that the period of détente, that relaxation of tensions between America and the Soviet Union, was crushed by the Soviet Union's decision to invade Afghanistan at the end of 1979. So this lesson, we're going to try and figure out why the Soviets invaded, why they lost, and what impact this had on the entire Cold War as a whole. As before, we've got quite a load of vocabulary which we haven't seen before, such as guerrilla tactics, the Mujahideen, and the Carter Doctrine. This is going to be a fairly content-heavy lesson again, which I'm very sorry for, but we do need to understand what Afghanistan was, why it was so important, and why the USSR failed to win there. It's worth remembering where Afghanistan is. Nowadays, it doesn't share a border with Russia. There's several countries in the way, but because the Soviet Union is not just Russia, it's Russia plus 14 other countries, it did share a border. Our course so far has been overwhelmingly focused on Europe, with the notable exceptions of the Cuban Missiles Crisis and Vietnam, America's intervention to prevent South Vietnam from turning communist. I've kept saying that we'll mention that much more in Year 11. In the Year 10 Cold War course, the war in Vietnam is kind of a side issue. It's already finished. It's already been taken over by North Communist Vietnam by the time Afghanistan is invaded. So we need to try and figure out why both America and the Soviet Union cared about this landlocked country in the middle of Asia. So we've got a documentary which I'd strongly recommend you watching. I've got some timestamps on this slide and next one. If you want to watch the entire thing, no one's going to stop you, but we've got around 25 minutes worth if you want to be a bit more focused. So up to 14 minutes 30 will address why Afghanistan was important to both the superpowers, why relations between Afghanistan and the Soviet Union were strained, how America made things worse with the supply of the Mujahideen, and why Amin was replaced by Karmal. Both of these are communist leaders, but the Soviet Union will actually assassinate one to replace him with another. Summing up the first part of that video then. In 1978, a communist government took control of Afghanistan in what is known as a coup d'etat. In other words, rather than a big civil war, they simply seized the government, they arrested most of the leaders, most of those were killed, and they declared Afghanistan to be a communist country. Because most Afghans were not given a choice in this, it's understandable that most Afghans were not happy with it, and this led to a civil war between those communists and mainly the Mujahideen, a collection of extremist Islamist groups. Now, we don't mean an ordinary Islamic group. These are people with a hardline understanding of what the Quran says. So, for example, very little regard for women's rights or freedom of speech or allowing other religions to take place. All of that would not be good for a communist, but neither would a normal Islamist idea. They don't believe in any sort of religion. Could be Islam, could be Christianity. They see it as a poison or a drug for the masses. So this hardline approach to any religion would also alienate your average Muslim in Afghanistan. So they would be more likely to support the Mujahideen, even if they didn't agree with how hardline an approach they took to Islam. So because communists don't believe in Christianity either, it is a complete coincidence that on Christmas Day 1979, Brezhnev sent thousands of troops and many thousands again and again and again in order to restore order and protect the government. The reason why I put those phrases into quotes is that by December, Brezhnev and the communist leader, Amin, did not see eye to eye. Amin believed that the communists in the Soviet Union were wrong. They had failed to make the Soviet Union a truly communist country after decades. So Amin wanted Afghanistan to go through very, very quick reforms. 2 days later, Amin was killed. He was first attempted to be poisoned by the personal chef in his governmental building, and a few hours later he was simply shot. He was replaced by a puppet leader called Babur Karmal. Just like in Hungary, 1956, just like in Czechoslovakia, 1968, the Soviets invaded the country and very quickly they installed a leader they could trust. The major difference with these other two, however, is that Afghanistan didn't have a long history of being controlled or even listening to the Soviet Union. It had only been a communist country for a couple of years. As a result, most people in Afghanistan didn't have the natural inclination to follow the Soviet Union. Even if you'd been a communist supporter of Amin's government, the fact that the communist government of the entire world, the Soviet Union, the fact that they'd invaded you to put in someone that they liked, meant that most of them simply deserted. So you've got this situation where a hardline Muslim collection of groups, the Mujahideen, gets support from loads of different types of people who wouldn't normally support it. The final group that would support them would be the Americans, which we'll talk about in a couple of minutes. So I've got another part of the clip to watch here, up to 25 minutes, but again, feel free to watch much more if you want to, and write down the tactics that the Soviets used and why they failed. Or to put it in other words, how did the Mujahideen try to counter or go against the Soviet tactics? If you've learned anything about the Vietnam War yet, a lot of these will seem incredibly familiar, and there'll be a question towards the end comparing the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan with the US intervention in Vietnam. So here are some points which my class have made in previous years. So the Soviet tactics seem incredibly sensible and would have a very good chance of working against a different opponent. But in general, they are either not relevant to the tactics which they are fighting, or they're counterproductive. They're actually doing more harm than good. So they'd use these vast sweeping tactics across the countryside designed to be used against America or China. But the Mujahideen wouldn't fight them fairly. If there was a big Mujahideen base out in the open, it would easily be crushed by the Soviets. So they simply didn't allow themselves to be crushed by the Soviets in that way. They would use guerrilla tactics or guerrilla tactics. In other words, not wearing uniforms, so you don't know who is a soldier and who is a civilian, laying traps and mines and ambushes, and then running away, going into the caves or hiding if you're outnumbered. Because Afghanistan is their home, they knew the local landscape far better than the Soviets ever could. So they would know the best places to attack, the best places to hide. They would know shortcuts between the mountains so they can get far further than the Soviets could. As a natural progression, the Soviets turned to their military advantages. They turned to the use of helicopters and mass bombings. Their thinking was, we don't know who is a civilian and who is a soldier, so let's simply kill as many of those people who might be a soldier. But that had the obvious downside of increasing hatred. We've already seen how many people would support the Mujahideen even if they hadn't wanted to. But a couple of years into the fighting, let's say it's 1982, you've resisted calls to support the Mujahideen, and then they kill your brother or they kill all of your children in a bombing raid. It's very understandable for you to turn to hatred and then support a group which you absolutely despise simply because the other side has personally wronged you. We've also got the role of the USA funding the Mujahideen, and we've got a clear statistic there of up to $200 million a year. As to why America is doing this for a organization which nowadays is so clearly against America, we've got a quote, "The enemy of my enemy is my friend." If you think right back to the start of this course, it explains why the Americans and the British supported Stalin during World War II. They saw Hitler as the bigger enemy, and in 1945 that absolutely was the case. But once Hitler was defeated, they realized that the new enemy, the Soviet Union, was just as challenging. So they keep thinking in this very short-term way. It seemed to work out in World War II, but it doesn't seem to work out in Afghanistan. We've said that the Mujahideen will turn into the Taliban, and the Taliban will plot 9/11. This has obviously led to the invasion of Afghanistan in 2001, a massive destabilizing effect in the Middle East. It's led to the rise of ISIS in Syria and places like that. All of these things are caused by short-term decisions by America and the West in general, trying to combat the enemy they see, rather than thinking about the longer-term consequences of their actions. The final bullet point at the bottom right is thinking about why the Soviet soldiers are there. In the video, they talk about the fact that they were essentially lied to. Many Soviet soldiers were told that they would be fighting America. If you think back to the first source, how we started this lesson, they say in their newspapers that they're doing this to prevent America taking over Afghanistan. But there were no American soldiers in Afghanistan. American supplies, American money, American intelligence, but no American soldiers. It's incredibly similar in Vietnam. The Soviet Union will support the communist Vietnamese, the Viet Cong. They'll send supplies, they'll send equipment, they'll send intelligence, but there won't be Soviet soldiers there. So because you've got one superpower supporting a side to fight the other superpower, we have one of those proxy wars. So an American is not killing a Soviet, they're just paying another group to do it. Moving on to results for America and superpower relations. President Carter took a firm line and created his Carter Doctrine. Before we look at that, remember the Truman Doctrine, which pretty much every president followed until Nixon and Ford. The Truman Doctrine said that America would use military force to contain the spread of communism. Places like Greece and Turkey were struggling to protect their democracy, so Truman pledged military supplies and military help if needed. The Carter Doctrine is so much more narrow-minded, and it reflects 30 years of Cold War tensions and Cold War fatigue. The Carter Doctrine said the American government would use military force, if necessary, to defend its national interests in the Persian Gulf. In other words, access to oil. On that map, you can see a red circle where Afghanistan is, and the lighter colours are the Persian Gulf region. All of those red and green lines show major pipelines for either gas or oil. This area is responsible for a large chunk of the world's supply to these vital resources. So if this area was controlled by a power which was against America or the West in general, they could simply turn off those pipelines and cause either an economic downturn or an entire crash of those countries' economies. So America gave itself the right to invade countries to protect its access to oil. He also set up a Rapid Deployment Force, or RDF, to try and back up the Carter Doctrine. This was a crack team of military personnel who would be able to be deployed at a moment's notice if a new place was invaded or a new area threatened. Much more significantly, Carter told the Senate not to ratify SALT II. Remember, that was one of the last agreements in last lesson when we looked at détente. SALT II was the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty Mark II. It was going to be so much more impressive than SALT I, which was already a very important first step. Carter had signed it and then sent it off to the American Congress to be voted on and turned into law. But in between the signing and the vote, the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, and as a result, Carter told Congress not to ratify it. He also cancelled grain exports to the Soviet Union, not to try and starve people in the Soviet Union, because they wouldn't at that point, but it would raise prices and cause economic pressure on the government. In any case, all of this shows that détente had died. The two superpowers were no longer willing to work with each other, and that so-called Second Cold War had begun. All of that was seen as too weak by most Americans, and President Carter was replaced by Ronald Reagan at the next election. Ronald Reagan is a tongue twister, but he also is a bit of a contradiction in himself. He'll start out being incredibly hardline towards the Soviet Union, but once he is faced with Mikhail Gorbachev, the final leader of the Soviet Union, he's much more willing to work with him. So he's actually responsible for raising tensions incredibly high, but bringing them back down again, and is a very important reason why the Cold War finally ended when it did. As another example of the breakdown of superpower relations, we have two Olympics, in 1980 in Moscow, Soviet Union, and in 1984 Los Angeles in America. The International Olympic Committee had been very clear to grant one and then to the other so that neither side could complain about favouritism. But the Moscow Olympics was boycotted by America and 64 other nations, mostly in Western Europe, but also many other places around the world, in protest of the invasion in Afghanistan. A boycott, if you're not sure, is where you either refuse to buy something or refuse to work with a group or cooperate with a group as a form of protest. As a completely useless bit of knowledge, the boycotting of the 1984 Los Angeles Olympics was terrible for McDonald's. Because before the boycott had been announced, McDonald's came up with a wonderful new ad campaign. It's called You Win, We Win. The idea was if you bought a burger and you got a little thing saying fencing or 100 meters dash or javelin or anything like that, if the Americans gained a medal, either gold, silver, or bronze, you would get a free meal or a free drink. They had been counting on the Soviet Union to win most of these medals. Remember, America and the Soviet Union were responsible for most of the medal wins, and they won every single Olympics during the Cold War. But because the Soviet Union pulled out, America won almost all of the most important medals, and it cost McDonald's absolutely millions more dollars than they had planned. So that is a lesson for you if you ever want to set up a business. Don't tie it to Cold War tensions. Moving on to less light-hearted results, we've got the truly awful death toll from the 10-year war. Soviet deaths number around 15,000, with tens of thousands more soldiers wounded from ambushes and mines and things such as that. The Mujahideen will suffer around 57,000 deaths, but the civilian deaths are anywhere between 500,000 up to a more likely 2 million deaths. That map on the right shows you the awful cost for this war as well. Very roughly speaking, any area which is dark grey has that red arrow, areas which the Soviet Union were able to keep a good hold on. All of the other areas were essentially no-go areas. These were the places where the raids were likely trying to happen, or those sweeping tactics, and that's where a lot of the casualties would be for the Soviets. Once they left the relative safety of places like Kabul, they would not be safe from the ambushes from the Mujahideen. Once they did finally leave in 1989, Afghanistan was plunged into a series of civil wars. There might be as much as 4 or 5 depending on how you count them. I've put a question mark for the end there because you can easily argue that even with the invasion of America and NATO forces in 2001, the civil war has merely continued up until this day. In any case, after the Soviets leave, a few short, bloody years of civil war result in Afghanistan turning into that Islamic fundamentalist state, essentially led by the Taliban, at least after another civil war. The costs for the Soviet Union are truly astonishing, not just in terms of the 15,000 soldiers who died, but the financial cost helped bankrupt the Soviet Union's economy. This was a major reason why communism fell by 1991. The new and final communist leader of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev, made a decision very early on to withdraw from Afghanistan, although it took 4 years to finally carry it out. He also decided to improve relations with America, firstly to try and cut the awful cost of the arms race, which Ronald Reagan was ramping up, but also to try and show people that he was a different type of leader. He was a committed communist, but he didn't believe in the ideology of people like Brezhnev. He didn't think you needed to invade a country to keep it communist. He was very much more like Naji or Dubček. He believed that people needed to choose communism, and a war to force communism was always doomed to fail. Finally, we need to come back to our lesson question. How did Afghanistan affect the Cold War in general? So first of all, think about the fact that Afghanistan was a communist, non-Warsaw Pact country invaded by the Soviet Union, unlike Hungary and Czechoslovakia. Think how this affected the propaganda war in the context of the wider Cold War. Does this make the Soviet Union look good or bad, weak or strong? Think about how communism was harmed in the failure in Afghanistan. It was failed and it was harmed militarily, economically, and ideologically. So to break those terms down, the Soviet military, with all the billions and billions of dollars pumped into it, was unable to beat these Muslim rebels, the Mujahideen. Economically, the Soviet Union was damaged, and as we've just said, it helped cause the fall of communism in general. And ideologically, the sheer idea of communism, that the government should have mass control over people's lives, for the good of the people, how far is that idea being challenged or mocked by their decision to invade a communist country to install a different type of communism? Have a look at the cartoon as well. You can see from that caption, it's from the Daily Telegraph, a British newspaper, and it was made just 2 weeks after the invasion. What does this suggest about the two sides in the invasion of Afghanistan? So you've got Brezhnev here in his dark, evil-looking outfit, charging forward with a mallet to crush this tiny Muslim rebel with his curved sword, we might call on Iraq or something like that. You might notice a slight visual pun here. That hammer and arak or curved sword seems to look like the hammer and sickle, the symbol of communism. Think about how far you agree with this interpretation of the war and what it focuses on and what it seems to ignore. Finally, we've got a stretch and challenge. The war in Afghanistan has been described as the Soviets' war in Vietnam. What similarities or differences have you found out this lesson? And I'll leave a couple of links to talk about the Vietnam War if you want to find out more about that now. And finally, how far did America, Britain, and all others in NATO or other Western countries fail to learn the lessons in their invasion of Afghanistan in 2001? I'll leave another link for the BBC, which will go into a bit more detail as to how all of these invasions and interventions in Afghanistan are linked together. That's everything you need to know about how Afghanistan affected the Cold War in general. We are on the home stretch, as it were. We've got around 4 or 5 more lessons before we get to the final breakup of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War in 1991.